Okay. Does this work? Yep. Welcome everybody to the second Nijmegen lecture by Professor Dennett. I'm not going to give an elaborate introduction. Peter Hago did that already yesterday. But to rehearse that, Peter did it in a lot of more detail. Dennett is one of the most prominent and one of the most influential philosophers, not just today, but I think in general. And with 18 books and hundreds and hundreds of papers, you would think that by now most philosophers with that amount of work done would sort of stick to their greatest hits. And they would definitely be entitled to do that. But Daniel Dennett's work is evolving constantly, and that is one of the really inspiring aspects of it. In the latest book, which is published last year, almost all the themes in the earlier work were present, but they are combined in new ways. They are given new twists and slight changes. There's new information from science and philosophy put in the mix, so to speak. And the result is really a fresh, new philosophical position, which is especially worth reading for those people who are already familiar with Daniel Dennett's earlier work. This evolution is really inspiring. And it's philosophical progress. And we are privileged, I think, to witness that exact same progress, because yesterday's lecture was already, it really contained new ideas or a new combination of old ideas leading to a new position that's not even present in the 2017 book. I think that's really great. I'm really looking forward to today's lecture, because it promises to be even more new and, as Professor Dennett says, it's work in progress, but it's exciting. So I'm really looking forward to your lecture on language and consciousness today.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you all for being here. And it is going to be somewhat exploratory today. As I've been telling some of my friends and colleagues here, I was up in the middle of the night throwing away slides and adding new things, and as late as 5 minutes to 8 this morning, I was remembering a point that I'd forgotten to put in and trying to figure out whether to include it. So this is going to be a bit of a potpourri, a bit of a grab bag, and we'll see. I'm sure it isn't quite in the right order, but this is what it looks like to me at 10 o'clock this morning. And with your help, I'm sure it will look different by noon. I'm going to start by sharing with you the meat of an email I got from a man named Richard Power, who is a retired artificial intelligence researcher in England. He sent me an email just sort of provoked by my last book, and saying what he thought, giving a diagnosis of one of the illusions of consciousness. And I'm just going to share it with you now. So there's Richard Power. I met him in Edinburgh just last year. Just about this time last year. We understand the concept of representation from external representations, such as pictures or verbal descriptions. For these descriptions, we can have direct experience of both a presenter, e.g. portrait painting, and a representer, e.g. portrait, and a representee, e.g. the person painted. Call these the medium and the content. By the way, is the technical person here? I don't have presenter view on. I have to switch to that right now if anybody knows how to do it. I think I do. But let me, I hope I do. Where's presenter view here? Go to slideshow. Thank you. There we go. Thank you. Ah, much better. Now I have a little advance warning of what I was going to say next. I found this picture on the internet as a nice example of where you get to see the representation and what it represents all at once at the same time. And you can compare the bits of green with the bits of gray and bits of green and so forth. That's a familiar idea, and it plays an important role in Power's point. He goes on to say, in short, we conceptualize the medium of our internal representations by abstracting some features from the content and attributing them to some kind of spiritual or ghostly substance. That is the best we can do, since actually we cannot experience the medium at all and have to look for analogies in the external world. This is the conceptual scheme that we bring to internal representations, because it's the only one we have. But there's a huge difference. For external representations, we can experience both medium and content, oil on canvas as well as people, trees, or whatever. But for internal representations, we do not experience the medium at all. The idea that the medium is some state of the brain seems intuitively absurd. So powerful is the illusion that we're dealing with an iconic representation in a medium of spirit. Now this illusion, is not a user illusion. It's a theorist's illusion. Or to put it slightly differently, dogs and dolphins are neither dualists nor materialists. So they're immune to this illusion. That doesn't mean they aren't conscious. It means they don't think there are qualia. Now, yesterday, I reminded you of Tootle, the train that ran off the tracks, and the little engine that could. And a point I want to make about them now is it's no accident that these choo-choo trains can talk. In fact, their stories could not be told without their having this talent. This is also, of course, a feature of that Wittgenstein leaf that I mentioned to you briefly yesterday. So let's start with an agent that can't talk and build up with a few steps. Now, what follows now is some sketchy work that I've begun working with Keith Frankish in Crete. And we are inspired by a book which, if you haven't read, you should run out and get and read soon, and that's Valentino Breitenberg's lovely little book, Vehicles, 1986, where he propounds the law of uphill analysis and downhill synthesis. In other words, it's easier, if you have a complicated system, it's easier to build it up out of parts you understand than to analyze the complex thing into its parts. And it's a collection, a wonderful collection of dead simple little vehicles that he gradually puts together into more and more impressive combinations. So, inspired by Breitenberg, Keith and I are looking at this idea of turning a drone into an autonomous vehicle, building up from simple cases. Let's start with so we make a drone that's going to, actually it's a military drone, and it's run by a drone operator, and it's dropping bombs. Let's be dramatic while we're at it. But one thing is, we don't want it to drop bombs on ambulances. So what are we going to do? Well, we're going to equip it with a Red Cross detector. The ambulance has a Red Cross painted on the roof, so we're going to add to its current capabilities a Red Cross detector. Well, it already has a video camera, and it has color video, and it's not all that hard today to make a Red Cross detector that will quite reliably pick out red crosses from the scene. Worth noting that the last thing you would want to do is have that red cross displayed on a screen the way it would be displayed on the remote control screen for the human user, because after all, the thing doesn't have eyes inside it to look at such a screen. You would just use the information in the signal, in the video signal, to devise a red cross detector without rendering that red anywhere. So now you've got a red cross detector, and you hook it up, wire it up to the switch, which says basically don't throw a bomb at this. Turns off the potential bomb thrower. So that's a very simple step, a step in the right direction. But of course, the drone wouldn't know anything about it. It would just be, if you like, the beneficiary of this installation that we put in. Well, of course, if we actually did this, there'd be an arms race, and the enemy would start painting red crosses on the tops of all of their vehicles. And a human drone operator would notice that there seems to be an awful lot of red crosses these days. So what we wanted to add now to the drone is it's already noticing red crosses, but it's noticing that it's noticing red crosses. So we add another layer and make it capable of noticing that it notices red crosses, and it's noticing quite a lot of them. We'll keep this again dead simple. We simply have a counter in there which clicks over and increments by 1 every time the red cross detector goes on, and that number builds up in a register. Easy. But of course, that number in that register is pointless unless something consults that register, something consumes that number and has a threshold or something like that, which triggers some further action. No use representing anything unless the representation is consulted, consumed, as Ruth Millikan would say, by some further bit of machinery. So we have to add something more to the drone so that it will take the appropriate steps. And I could go on in this vein for the rest of the hour, adding and adding and adding. This is what part of what Keith and I are working on, and since we haven't got our act together yet, I'm going to just leave that to your imagination and go on and say, notice that as I've imagined it so far, when the drone comes back and we've thought of a new thing to add, we go in there and we tinker with the software. We add some more code. We rewrite the program a little bit. And for instance, we might want to move from that way of doing this redesign work. Initially, we'd design it, install it. We might want to make it easier for ourselves by getting the drone in a position where we could interrogate the drone when it came back. But of course, to interrogate the drone, we have to have some sort of signaling system, some sort of language where we know what the drone's answers mean. Well, we can rig that up pretty easily from our software designer's point of view, and that means we don't have to go in always and look hard at the code. We can just ask it, maybe at a keyboard. Doesn't matter how the interrogation is done. But of course, if we can interrogate the drone, and we could use that interrogation to give us ideas about what to design next, But wouldn't it be nice if we could advise the drone and say, what if you look for this? Why don't you look for that? And make it so that it could take that advice on board. Well, now we're going to need quite an elaborate system of interaction between us, the drone designers, and it. I invite you to imagine the various steps you would go through to gradually improve the drone. And notice that every improvement you make is actually heightening the autonomy of the drone. It's giving it more onboard control of what it does. We've got the wisdom, imagined in this case, about this is what I would do if I were sitting in the control room. I want to make sure that all the moves that I would make, or as many of them as I can muster, it would make too. So we can imagine this process going on for quite some time. Now that's not nature's way of turning us into responsible, autonomous agents. But it's a good way to get clear about the competences that are involved. We get a sort of list of the specs. And this is really the way good old-fashioned AI proceeded in the 70s and 80s. They thought hard and intelligently about what did a system have to do in order to do what I want it to do. What does it have to know? What information does it have to have? How should the information be linked to other sources of information? And so we had this era of the flow chart with boxes, the boxology of good old-fashioned AI, with all these subunits eventually executed in software that were supposed to accomplish these tasks. And it led to a thriving industry of specs articulation, you might say. But it was, in some ways, a dead end, but only in some ways. We learned, I think, a tremendous amount from this. Here's an old slide of mine. Here's what was wrong with this, the walking encyclopedia. We have all of these boxes, and they have arrows between them, and they talk to each other, and the world knowledge gets updated by the belief fixation box, which gets information from perceptual analysis, and there's the language acquisition device, and the lexicon and logic, and all the rest of these boxes doing their work, contributing their parts. And it's bureaucratically quite efficient, but that's not nature's way. One of the questions that one always had to ask about these boxes was how did the homunculi, because each one was a sort of homunculus. In fact, my favorite case of that was an early AI system done by Bill Woods and his colleagues called WHIM, Hear What I Mean. And this was for understanding natural language. Of course, the problem has basically been solved, by the Siri, for instance, and by very different route. But in this good old-fashioned AI, GoFi system, the first box you had was a phonology, taking the acoustic raw signal and turning it into phonemes. And when Bill Woods and his colleagues started, they had no idea how to build that part. So they simply put a phonologist in the box. I mean, a real live practicing phonologist who would listen to the acoustic signal and write out the phonological, the phonemic representation of that, which then was, the phonologist was kept officially, was supposed to be completely innocent of any semantic knowledge. It was just the job of translating acoustic signal into phonology, which is already a pretty tough job. So each box was really a sort of homunculus. Sometimes an actual live human being could serve one of those roles. And that's the way this was conceived. Well, how do the homunculi talk to each other? In a language that both parties can understand, but this is already a huge distortion. what people in GOFI research did was they basically would create a sort of theorist's innocent illusion of meaning by simply using English terms, usually in capital letters, to stand for whatever concepts were supposed to be in being transmitted between the boxes. They sort of would say, well, we hereby baptize the word capital D-O-G. It means dog. And H-O-U-S-E, capital letters, that means house. This is the house concept, this is the dog concept. And you put them together and you can get a dog house. But there was a certain element of make-believe in this, which was pointed out soon enough. One of my favorite papers on this was by Bill Woods, the WHIM creator. A classic paper called What's in a Link? And he pointed out that in these diagrams, in the box would be a word: house, dog, Boise, Idaho. But that, if you thought that was somehow installing a concept at a node, you were just fooling yourself. The only way the concept could be at that node is if it was linked in the right way to other things. So the links, all the meaning had to be in the links, not in what you put in the box. Was really just a sort of mnemonic aid to the programmer. Now, this led to a field known as procedural semantics. One of its early critics was my late friend Jerry Fodor, and he scoffed at it. If you want to recover that ancient battle, you might want to read one of his amusing papers, Tom Swift and His Procedural Grandmother, a classic Jerry Fodor rant against the whole idea of procedural semantics. But I think that in his zeal to drive a stake through the heart of procedural semantics, he threw out something important. But I will just try to illustrate that in passing. But this is the general idea. By using terms of English, typically, the programmer had a handy reminder of what that node or subroutine or data structure was supposed to mean. Wait a minute, why? Every now and then. It was more of a comment than a part of the code. That is to say, when you write code and you put comments on the code, that's not for the computer, that's for the computer programmer. It just reminds. It's a little sort of nudge to the program. This is what I want this to do. This is what it's supposed to be. But one of the illusions, I suppose, of GOFI was that sometimes people forgot that they were treating the comments in the boxes as if they were the contents, really, rather than a note, a promissory note for this is where we want the content such and such to be. Now, I think that gives us a little perspective on something more current, and that is Watson, IBM's Watson, which famously won in Jeopardy, the television quiz show. And a lot of people are hugely overimpressed with Watson. It is a wonderful piece of work, and it has some real uses in the real world, and I don't want to dismiss that at all. But it lives in a world of text. In that way, it's entirely parasitical on human comprehension. It takes the articulated texts in many languages off the internet and has ways of extracting information from those texts and using it in quite remarkable and reliable ways. but it's parasitical on the fact that those strings of symbols have established meanings in whatever language they are, and those established meanings are the meanings that are understood by the users, the speakers of that language. So what Watson is it's not an agent, it's a tool. It's made to look agent-like by some clever Disney-fied trickery, but it's not an agent at all. Or if it is, it's a very minimal agent. All it can do is answer questions with questions. And even in the case of Jeopardy, they had to change the rules somewhat to make it easier for Watson to have a fair go at it. So it's very important to understand what Watson isn't. And perhaps a way to understand that is to look at another celebrated and duly celebrated marvel of software, and that's Google Translate, which also is entirely parasitic on human understanding. The way Google Translate works is by simply mining the comprehending translations of all the translators who've ever translated. And it simply uses that corpus of translations and breaks it down in very clever ways so that it can make remarkably good guesses about how to translate a sentence from Hungarian into a sentence in English, and it doesn't understand anything. It's just pattern matching. It doesn't know whether the text it's translating is about baseball or climate change or as a novel. It has no inkling of any of that. It's, in my terms, competence without comprehension, but it sure is competent, getting better every day. It doesn't have to understand the sentences it translates. Now, here's a question. Is that a bug or a feature? The fact that it doesn't have to understand the sentences. I'm going to argue that from my point of view it's a feature, because I want to point out that your brain doesn't understand Dutch or English either. You do. But your brain doesn't. And yet somehow activities in your brain succeed in translating quite effortlessly, in the case of all of you, from my English into Dutch, or maybe just don't even bother translating. You have English so well in your heads, you don't need to even think about how to translate it into Dutch. I'm going to try to enlarge on that point. I just said that Google Translate. Well, I said that Watson wasn't an agent at all, really just a tool, and Google Translate similarly. It's not an agent; it's just a tool. Very good tool, wonderful tool for many purposes. But it's not an agent. What would an agential architecture look like? Well, there is one, I think, quite pioneering example that's being worked on right now, and that's Arcadia. It's the work of Paul Bellow and Will Bridewell. And Arcadia, you know this is sort of a tip of the hat to good old-fashioned AI, because Arcadia is an acronym, the way programs typically were in those days. So Arcadia stands for Adaptive Reflective Cognition in an Intention-Driven Integrated Architecture. Reminds me of Cyrus, C-Y-R-U-S, which was a Roger Schank program which was supposed to simulate the memory of Cyrus Vance, who was then Secretary of State. But Cyrus, of course, stood for Computerized Yale Retrieval and Understanding System. This was a little fetish that people had in those days. it's nice to see that some people still rely on it. So Bridewell and Bellow, if you want to get some details about their architecture, you might read this, A Theory of Attention for Cognitive Systems. You can get lots of other references from the web. I won't bother putting them in. But here's a few quotes about the Arcadia architecture. On each cycle in Arcadia, components report the results of their processing to what they call interlingua elements. These results are read from and reported to a shared volatile location called accessible content. This is all top-down intelligently designed by Bridewell and Bellow. And this is what happens in one stroke, and then the cycle continues with competition and collaboration at every step. So you get this continuous depositing into the interlingua, which then broadcasts in certain ways. I'm not going to try to explain the details of how this works, but just give you a sense of the flavor of the thing and why it might actually be an agent. It resembles, I think you will notice, if you know about this, the global neuronal workspace model of Bernie Bars and Changeux and Dehaene and their colleagues, in that it's a sort of a competitive arena of broadcast. And these are ideas that have many ancestors in cognitive science, going back to Oliver Selfridge's pandemonium model, but also including elements of SOAR and other ActStar. I won't go into those details. I think that Paul and Will have some new ideas involved here. Mainly, it faces the tough issues on how information about things actually gets shared and used. It's easy to overlook the fact that in the Changeux and Dehaene models, you get lots of arrows which are deemed to carry information, to broadcast information to particular sub-elements of the brain, but there's no clue about how those sub-elements are able to make that arrow into anything like a meaningful bit of information. It's a causal link, but what happens, I mean, if you have somebody patiently explaining in Hungarian to me how to fix my car, don't expect me to extract any value from that, because I don't know any Hungarian. The information is in the signal, but I'm not equipped to receive the information. And so there's a big issue there, which at least Bellow and Bridewell are beginning to tackle in an interesting way. But it's in a Goldfire way. It's a top-down way. One of the interesting things is that none of the components has to understand the interlingua. They just have to be able to use it. They just have to be designed to do the appropriate thing with each signal they receive. And that's a triumph of intelligent design to the extent that they achieve it. But this makes them like a Ruth Millikan unit tracker of affordances. It doesn't have to understand a thing, it's just a well-designed tracker of something of relevance to the agent in question. And Google Translate shows how powerful such a component can be. It can translate between languages without understanding the signals. And so we know that it's possible to get quite sophisticated discriminations and interactions and transformations out of uncomprehending but well-designed tracking devices. Now here's a slide from yesterday. The different degrees of control. I reminded you that you can have just mind wandering, you can have obsessive compulsive repetition, you can have situation where you're fighting distraction, or where you don't have to fight distraction, you're so attending to the problem that you're hard to distract. There's all these different ways, these different states of self-control that are all familiar to all of us. And the ability to shift between those states has to be installed. And if we're going to have our drone with all of these possibilities to think about, we don't want its mind wandering. We don't want to install a master controller that is rigidly designed. We want this control to be accomplished by the resolution of competitions between all the different possibilities that we've decided to install in the system. Now, if we think of ourselves as drone emancipators, we play the role of guardian, in effect, for the drone. I'm setting this drone up. I've been its guardian so far. I'm there at the controls. I'm keeping it out of harm's way. And now I want to let it become its own guardian. We want to design it to take care of itself. Now, this is a role that we know well. It's what we do when you parent an infant. Somehow, in the first 2 years of life, we create an autonomous agent. An agent that we can advise, that we can interrogate, that we can make suggestions to, that we can warn, that we can reprimand, that we can alert, cajole, comfort, all the rest. And we do this without understanding what we're doing. So this very process of parenting, of doing all the intelligent design, doing the work nature's way, is an example of competence without comprehension. You don't have to have a degree in anything to be a good parent, autonomous agent designer. What you do is you just, in effect, you scaffold the infant by assuming that the infant understands more than the infant actually does. And you gradually shape its responses without trying to. It just is a quite unconsciously guided process by which, by interacting with a newborn child, you gradually install, tune, sharpen, focus all those talents that the intelligent designers otherwise would have to do by installing the software. You don't know anything about the software, the hardware, the brain. You don't have to. Happily, the brain has the innate competence to be trained in this way, to be adjusted and tuned in this way. So we teach the child to self-monitor. But we don't teach it by teaching. We just raise the child, and the interactions involved in raising the child will automatically endow the child with a capacity to notice its own noticings and to notice its noticings of its noticings, and so forth, not forever, but to surprisingly high levels, and to reflect on them. So unlike top-down AI, we don't get to baptize the representation. We don't even know we don't know anything about the medium of representation in there. That was one of Power's points. You have no access to the medium of representation in your own brain. You just have access to the contents. But now the question is, how do you have access to the contents? So now, without a language, is all competence just competence without comprehension? This is the I think, oversimplification that my view seems to be leading towards. From bacteria to Bach and back, I acknowledge that a kind of comprehension is manifest in bears and coyotes and wolves and dogs and cats and dolphins and birds and octopus and so forth. But it's a sort of behavioral understanding. They know what to do when, and they're very adroit at knowing what to do when. But recalling the Piaget quote from yesterday, do they know what to do when they don't know what to do? That, I think, is an unanswered question, and my suggestion is that they don't. That it is a rare and noticeably special case of intelligence when we find an animal that knows what to do when it doesn't know what to do. There are some very telling examples. Corvids, in particular, are remarkably ingenious, but even there, you have to look closely at the details. I want to suggest an example which has long inspired me. I mention this with, I want to put a little caveat on this study. I don't know the extent to which it's ever been replicated. So bear that in mind, but at least I'm going to use it just to make a very interesting point, which I think will hold up. But let's see. Here's a little game you can play in the lab if you're a psychologist. It's called Match the Sample. Okay, the sample is in the upper left-hand corner. Your job is to touch the symbol that matches it. Match the sample. So, of course, that's the one you touch, right? Ooh, it's not even visible on the screen. Turned it yellow. Should have turned it red. Is it visible? Barely, okay. But you get the idea. So match the sample is a task that, say, chimpanzees can learn and do very, very well. And you're probably not all that surprised and not all that impressed. But here's something that they can't do. Higher order match the sample. Here's a case. By the way, the study I'm talking about is Sally Boyson and her colleagues, higher order match the sample. A language-naive chimpanzee, Japan troglodytes, judge relations, da-da-da-da. So here's the test now. Okay, how do you match the sample here? Which one is it? That one. Why? Because they're both the same. How about this one? Right? Okay. You're good at higher order match the sample. Using the techniques that animal researchers typically use to train animals, which means sometimes hundreds or even thousands of training trials, they were unable to get these chimpanzees to pass this test. Unable. Until they introduced what they called labels for same and different. They just had some plastic tokens, which they introduced and trained the animals to push the label button or put that token in the tray when the stimuli were the same, and put the other token in when the stimuli were different. So I put labels in quotes there because they were just pieces of plastic. I mean, label has lots of connotations for us understanders that perhaps were not there. They were, in any case, They were not really words. They weren't the word same or the word different. You couldn't use them in a grammatical sentence or anything like that. They were just a thing that had a role in holding attention. They weren't memes either unless you relax the replication requirement on memes, because they weren't, well, they were taught somewhat laboriously to a few chimpanzees, which is not the way memes normally get replicated. But sometimes. Calculus is a good example. It's not all that catchy, at least in my experience. What these were cognitive crutches or prostheses. They were thinking tools. They were attention holders or focus holders. And they worked. Once they introduced the labels, the chimpanzees had no trouble doing the higher order match the sample. They'd been scaffolded up, given a boost. Now, I want to suggest, and those of you who haven't read Ruth Milliken's new book, Beyond Concepts, are in for a treat, but what I want to suggest is that words play the same role in our brains. They provide cognitive crutches to help us keep track of our uniceps, that's her term, by labeling them with salient phonemic anchors. Now, this is a phenomenon that we're familiar with. If you take a wine tasting class, the teachers give you terms which they teach you by ostension. This is tannin, this is acidity, etc. And you use that little episode of learning to acquire a new tracking capacity. Now you can track tannin in a wine, and you've got a word for it. It helps. You don't have to have a word for it, but it sure helps. They could have used little plastic tokens. People don't take too well to that. So here's my suggestion, and that's all I can say about it right now. Words are unit trackers of our uniceps. I'm using Millikanese here, which I urge you to learn, and it'll take some practice, some reading and rereading. Unit trackers are those little gadgets that track affordances that matter. They're not concepts, they're just trackers. Uniceps are the nodes of a large network of knowledge which are fed each by a unit tracker of one sort or another. And what I'm suggesting here is that words are unit trackers for uniceps, and it's because we have words for our concepts that we're able for the first time to treat our own uniceps as objects of attention, that we can notice them and notice that we notice them. Now, how does this work? Here's the question that I think here's the question I'm trying to answer. And I've been puzzled by this question for a long time. I'm still puzzled by it. This is just my current stab at it. Maybe you'll have better ideas. How do we get from subpersonal states and events that have unwitting content to personal level states and events whose contents are manifest somehow to the person? Now let's just remind ourselves that what the frog's eye tells the frog's brain, classic early inaugural paper of cognitive science. Well, the frog doesn't have to know what the frog's eye tells the frog's brain. It just has to be equipped with this system which turns on the tongue zotter, which then grabs the moving fly out of the air. Many, many years ago, Michael Arbib suggested to me that he wanted to write a paper called What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frogs, very famous paper by Letson, Maturana, McCulloch, and Pitts. He was going to write a paper called What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog. And that's the difference that we're looking for here. That's the difference we're looking for. We want to get, to, as it were, to the personal level from the subpersonal competences, which are all sort of unwitting. And here I'm going to turn to a colleague of mine for a little help, and that's Ray Jackendoff. He's seen here in his office, which was right next to mine until a few weeks ago when he retired, and you can see his electric trains in his office. He's like some other academics, electric train, miniature train enthusiast. And when he says, oh, this is too small to read, isn't it? In a paper called How Language Helps Us Think, he writes of a module dumbly, obsessively converting thoughts into linguistic form and vice versa. So he imagines, really, some little competences without comprehension, which can get trained up to do this work. This inspired Bryce Hubner and me to push this a little further. This is Bryce wearing his Xantippe crew shirt. That was my sailboat. He was not only my postdoc, but also part of the crew on my sailboat. Alas, no longer my sailboat. And what Bryce and I came up with is blurts. One of the things I tell my students is when they're stumped, when they come to me and they've got writer's block and they're in desperate straits, I say, blurt it out, then you have something to fix. And that principle is, I think, at the heart of the training that infants go through. They blurt it out. They don't know what they're saying. They don't have to know what they're saying. It doesn't mean anything yet. And it gradually sort of comes to mean something, and gradually it comes to mean something because it gets fixed. It gets fixed by interaction of rather simple and gentle sorts with parents and others. So, quoting from the paper that Bryce and I wrote, schematically, a conceptualized thought triggers the production of a linguistic representation that approximates the content of that thought, yielding a reflexive blurt. Such linguistic blurts are proto-speech acts, issuing subpersonally, not yet from or by the person, and they are either sent to exogenous broadcast systems, where they become the raw material for personal speech acts. That is, you say them. Or they are endogenously broadcast to language comprehension systems, which feed directly into the mind reading system. Here, blurts are tested to see whether they should be uttered overtly, as the mind reading system accesses the content of the blurt and reflexively generates a belief that approximates the content of that blurt. I don't know if you can unpack all that on a single reading. I don't know how I can help you with it. My suggestion then is that this is where the step is taken, which gets us from subpersonal, unwitting meaning to personal level meaning. Part of this process is still in the fog for me, but maybe you'll have some ideas. Systems dedicated to belief fixation are then recruited, beliefs are updated, the blurt is accepted or rejected, and the process repeats. Thus, does your belief box get filled with not just beliefs, but beliefs clothed to some degree in language, beliefs that you can express if interrogated, or if you interrogate yourself. Proto-linguistic blurts thus dress System 1 outputs in mentalistic clothes, facilitating system-level metacognition. A lot of jargon there. Let me intersperse a little thought experiment for you, give you some idea of this, how this might work. I want you now all to imagine putting a plastic wastebasket over your head and climbing hand over hand up a rope. Please, do that. Huh? Was that difficult? No. I deliberately chose behaviors and items that would be very familiar to, say, a chimpanzee in a cage. Nothing arcane or sophisticated there. Here's my conjecture. It's only a conjecture. You had no trouble imagining that. The chimpanzee can't do it. It's simply one of the tricks that you have that the chimpanzee doesn't have is offline imagining of things that are not of immediate relevance to its life. Now, I might be wrong, but I think the reason that you have the source of your ability to do that simple thing, well, in the immediate instant was, I asked you to do it. And you heard me and you understood me, and it gave you a task to do, and you performed it. But of course, you could ask yourself to do it. You could ask yourself to do it using words, but you wouldn't have to, because you're just used to the fact that you can play with your own brain. You can self-stimulate. You can get your brain to conjure up all kinds of different worlds by a process of self-stimulation that you yourself have no insight into the mechanics of. You don't know how you do it. Everybody, please, imagine a purple cow. How'd you do it? You just did it. The content is available to you. The process by which you brought that content into existence is essentially inscrutable. It's not accessible to you. It's not part of what you have access consciousness to. Now, how do we shed some further light on this? I want to go to Ray Jackanoff again and remind you of the Friar's Fringe, my term for his theory of his model of consciousness. This goes way back to his 1987 book, Consciousness and the Computational Mind, where I think the single most important feature of that book, which has many, is he argues that conscious of control. It's peripheral. It's halfway down the mountain. It's at an intermediate level. It's not at headquarters. It's somewhere peripheral, somewhere intermediate. And in fact, there is no summit. That's to make the mistake of thinking there's a Cartesian theater where all the serious understanding happens. No, the understanding happens. The links that, as Bill Wood said, have to be there. That's where the meaning resides. The links, you don't have any access directly to those links. You only have access you can tell us about, to some of the products of those links, to the representations that you can tie to words and speak to us. So Ray's excellent half step forward is to dismantle the traditionally mysterious and unanalyzable grasping or comprehending by the subject in the Cartesian theater, outsourcing all that work to unconscious high-level processes. Into which we have no introspective access at all. Now, I love that idea. But some people don't. And I'm going to close by giving you my favorite example of somebody who doesn't like that or didn't like that idea, and that's my late great friend Jerry Fodor, who put it with his usual verve. If, in short, there's a community of computers living in my head, there had also better be somebody who is in charge, and by God, it had better be me. No, Jerry, no. That is the perfect articulation of exactly the wrong idea. I once said in a sort of festschrift about Jerry that some philosophers are like a lumpy, soft bed. You trample on them and you just sink deeper into the pillows. But Jerry is like a human trampoline. And you jump on him and you bounce. And to paraphrase a well-known expression, if I can see farther than others can, it's because I've been jumping on Jerry. Thanks very much for your attention.
Right, okay, thank you very much. We've got half an hour for questions now. There are people with microphones, but I'm not sure where they are.
Thank you. That was a very interesting talk. If I understood you correctly, you said that we can only have access to the kind of things that we have language for. Is that? I thought you said that. But then, how about often we have feelings that we do experience consciously, but we can't put them into words? How do you kind of connect the two?
Oh, that's good. And my answer, tentatively, is there's got to be a sort of inner horizon, a depth of analysis beyond which we have not yet reached. And that's where the ineffable resides, where you don't have words for it. And you can't put it into words. But that's a movable horizon. An example I sometimes have used in class is I take a guitar, acoustic guitar, and just strum the low E, just pluck the low E, and you hear a sound. And you can recognize that's the sound of a guitar. And it seems to be homogeneous, uniform, doesn't seem to have any parts. It's just that guitarish, ineffable guitarishness. Pluck it again. You can do this at home if you have a guitar. Carefully bring your finger down over the octave fret. Don't push it down to the fret. Just bring your finger down to touch the string. And what happens is the bottom falls out of the note and you get a pure high overtone. But I said the bottom falls out of the note. It might seem, oh, I haven't heard that sound before, but then you realize you have. It was part of the sound you heard the first time. Now, strum it a third time, and now you hear the separation clear as anything. You've just taught yourself how to track a new feature. It'll go away. It'll be hard to recover unless you get very good at it. Piano tuners are very good at listening for beats, and trained musicians are good at this. You can take apart experiences that heretofore have been homogeneous for you, and the only thing you say is, well, I don't know, it's a guitar. And that, of course, is not very descriptive. It might be very accurate. You might be very good at telling a guitar from a lute, from a banjo. How do you do it? I don't know. One sounds like a guitar, one sounds like a lute, one sounds like a banjo. Well, your ability to reflect on your abilities here, I think you wouldn't have without language. And it's our embedding in a world of language and conversation that creates this demand for further explanation of what we're conscious of, and the demand when you find no resources for responding to that demand, that's when you do the power thing and you create an ineffable quale and say, well, it's because there's this guitar quale, you see, it's ineffable, indescribable, unique, homogeneous, and intrinsic, and that's how I know it's a guitar. If you say that, you're just kidding yourself. You're inventing a theory when you should be simply saying, well, I don't know how I tell a guitar from a banjo, I just know I can under most circumstances. Does that help at all? That's the best I can do right now.
3, 4 questions, starting with the presentation.
Thank you, Dan, for another provoking lecture. As you know, I now then look into the old literature, and then I find texts that express ideas that we reinvent these days.
Yes.
That
Whom have I reinvented today?
no, Ray did. So in 1881, Heimann Steinthal wrote, "We translate the content of our thoughts into words. The content sends its word substitutes into consciousness because it cannot get there itself." Right? There it is.
Lovely.
And then he works it out in basically all the detail that Ray did later. And next, he creates a blurred theory of language evolution, creating.
Fantastic.
So it makes us humble, I'm
Yeah.
afraid.
That reminds me of a hobby horse of mine. Not too late to do it. Many of us old graybeard types lament the fact that our students are largely ignorant of anything that is not on the web and that they don't have on their smartphone. And what I thought would be a very valuable and pleasant project would be to get, in different fields, get a dozen emeritus professors of X together for a nice weekend at a nice place. And the idea is they've got to come with their golden oldies, their favorite ideas from the past that they wish their students knew and don't. And they would put them all together and discuss them. And then you wouldn't have to write a published volume. They just put them on the web, of course. But we would resurrect a lot of these papers and rediscover some of the insights, because I know that you're right. It happens to me all the time. This term, I'm teaching a seminar called 50 Years of Consciousness Research. And we're going back over, well, we start actually with What the Frog's Eye Tells the Frog's Brain, and also some of David Hubel's early work. On it goes from there. And rereading these papers myself for the first time in 30, 40 years, I am continually struck at how often these august predecessors of ours hit one nail on the head or another that we are just now reinventing or should reinvent now. So thank you.
I'll join in.
Yeah, let's. Now, who's going to give us the grant?
Thanks, Dan. That was great. So I see the problem. I'm not sure I see the solution yet. So we've got competence without comprehension, and then comprehension is going to somehow come in through clothing thoughts in language. That's the idea, right? But then when it comes to unpacking the clothing of thoughts in language, this is still more, it seems to me, competence without comprehension. So where does the comprehension come from in the end? And now I can see that that may be a feature, and you don't want it to be the case that we're sneaking in comprehension somewhere as a kind of homunculus. But I still have the sense that it's just going to turn out to be all knowing what to do when, so just competence. And yeah, how do we get to the thing that we're looking for in the end? I'm not sure I see that last stage.
Good.
And
no,
the blurts are supposed to do that for us, are they?
Yes.
So it's supposed to be like, well, I just put it out there and then I get corrected. So it's the loop through the correction by others that's doing the work for us of getting us to comprehension, is it? Do you see the last bit?
Yeah, I think you've articulated my own worry with my staff perfectly. So let me address it. Remember how the GoFi people thought they were going to do it? Bill Woods et al. They were going to use something like procedural semantics. And they were going to handcraft all these links to all the behaviors that mattered, all the verifications, the testings, the uses, and so forth. They were going to build up a huge network of themselves individually competent without comprehending networks. And when they built them up to a certain point, they claim that the whole network doesn't understand. It sort of becomes empty of meaning, because look what the network does. I mean, if that isn't understanding, what would understanding be? It is a very effective and adept user of the language. And if that doesn't, now, this is the behaviorist in me coming out. What more could there be to understanding? Now, a lot of people say that's the trouble with Dennett. He's a sort of crypto behaviorist. And I think, no, that's not the trouble. That's a feature, not a bug. You don't want to have Fodorian sort of magical comprehension sitting in some special place in the middle of the head or anywhere else. You're going to have to build the, let's call it the molar global property of comprehension out of molecules that are themselves competent without comprehension. And that the difference is that to say that, well, let's see if I can make it seem sort of paradoxical. Well, how do you test a student to see if the student really understands some topic? You grill them. And if they can explain it, what more is there? well, explained it as well as anybody I've ever heard. I don't think he understands it. I think that verges on the self-contradictory. I think it's an artifact of traditional but bad philosophy to think of grasping, a la Frege, as this sort of mysterious extra relationship that a self, a person, an ego can have to a concept or to a word. And we have to, just as we have to dismantle the Cartesian theater of consciousness, we have to dismantle the idea of grasping as a sort of atomic mental act. Can't be.
I don't know your names, but the question really in the back, that's
Yeah.
next in line. And there's someone in the middle who's next in line.
Thank you. I was wondering if I followed the lecture correctly. I think you compared designing and kind of programming a drone to parenting an infant, and I think that's actually simplifying this a lot. So I do assume that children do at least have some sort of autonomy on the very beginning.
Autonomy?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, remember, bacteria have some sort of autonomy. Trees have some sort of autonomy. Sure, individual neurons have some sort of autonomy, and babies have lots of autonomy compared to the cells they're made of. But there's a long way still to go before they are a self-reliant agent that can live in the complex world. The fact that children require guardians, the fact that childhood in our species is so prolonged, actually means that we get to look at this process of design much more closely because we have several years to see it unfold. That's what a lot of, child psychologists, developmental psychologists do their work on, watching the incremental development of abilities which enhance autonomy.
There was a question. I think it should be what you did.
Yeah, this is along similar lines. When you were talking about parenting, I was thinking about the case of Jeannie, who was, severely abused, socially isolated, deprived of language. I mean, clearly she has some autonomy. She had, if bacteria do. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the ways in which her autonomy or her comprehension might have differed from someone at a comparable age when she was discovered.
Oh, yes. The case of Jeannie is very, very sad. A girl in Southern California who was raised by seriously deranged and sadistic parents. And when she was discovered, I think she was about 13, and had hardly any language, and was in many ways damaged by her upbringing. And well, part of the story runs like this. Among the responses when Jeannie was discovered was that a lot of researchers wanted access to Jeannie right away because they thought this was whatever else she was an experiment of nature that they wanted very, very eagerly to examine. And I remember talking with Vicki Fromkin about it at the time, and we tried to set up a foundation to take care of Jeannie and to monitor and restrict access to Jeannie from overeager researchers. That failed. That fell apart, never got off the ground. And the rest of the story of Jeannie is not pleasant. I don't know if she's still alive. but profoundly disabled by this terrible upbringing she had. I haven't looked at the details for a long time, so I'm very rusty on the details. But it's a sad story, and there's several books. One called Jeannie was pretty good, but there's I think several books and articles about her worth reading if you want to pursue that. I don't know if I can answer your question, but you raise a good question.
Yeah, I mean, I think with so much about Jeannie, it's difficult to tease apart the effect of language versus the effect of abuse.
Yeah,
So I
exactly.
think probably
Yeah.
it probably is difficult to comment on
Yeah.
the effects on autonomy and agency.
Yeah.
Last question again. So it's a kind of a similar line, but it's a bit less maybe dramatic. So I would like to push a bit forward this idea of making a drone autonomous, right?
Making
So a drone autonomous, a robot, a drone, a flying drone. Zzz, you know the drones?
sorry.
I'm sorry, I have fewer vowels that
Yeah.
English should allow. So you seem to suggest that it's via this parenting-offspring relationship that the process of independization happens. So it's like creating together a system of symbols and meaning via parents and their children. And in a way, it's because they do create a kind of interlingua, right? And of course, drones and robots don't have this ability to culturally transmit or even just to create a kind of genetic memory. So in a kind of sci-fi world, if drones were able to transmit information to one another in a kind of parent-child-children way, would you expect at a certain point that they would start becoming conscious? It's a very thought experiment.
Yeah. That's a very good question. And of course, in principle, yes, I would. But I think that the interest lies in the details which we just wave our hands about how this teaching is going on. I'm puzzled. Wait a minute, I'm trying to think of a name. Oh, this is embarrassing. Senior moment. The gray parrot, Alex, was the parrot of Irene Pepperberg. Yes, of course. And something which I always thought was the real masterstroke in Irene's work with Alex the Great Parrot was she, as far as I know, but Pim will probably tell me no, she reinvented somebody else's idea. She found that when she went to train another parrot, the best way to train another parrot was to pay attention to Alex and train Alex a bit more, and the other parrot would be jealous and eager to learn and would pay close attention to what was going on and would learn sort of vicariously from watching Irene train this already pretty well-trained parrot. And she put that to good use. It's just one example of the sort of subtlety that's involved in shaping an unshaped mind. And we can recognize that, and then we can put that into our fantasy about the drones, or not. And we can think of other ways that the drones might share information. I think it's too unconstrained a thought experiment at this point to know what to say, but I think in principle, sure, we could have drones that had language and had memes and transmitted memes. and we're enculturated. But that's a big leap.
So that's the end for now, but the discussion will continue at 2 o'clock in the Max Planck Institute. Two different discussion sessions take place. First, thank Professor Dennett.
Thank you.
I like your answer to Julia, actually, because I was wondering about comprehension while reading your book constantly. Because you say that we can adopt the intentional stance to competencies. And then I was like, oh my god, but the intentional stance was supposed to be the highest level, and now it's comprehension.
Can you grab that? Oh, I need that too, yeah. Yeah,
Oh yeah.
there we go. That's it.
Yeah,
Just
but it
push.
doesn't- Yeah. Like seriously, okay. Yep.